FC25 just dropped, so you know what that means. We get to spend the next 12 months fiddling with knobs to try to make this game playable. I'm about to break down all the settings and slider values that you need to make FC25 a fun, enjoyable, realistic experience. So let's get into it. So a couple things to note before we get started. The first is that this video is going to break down version 1.0 of my slider set. So we are going to be going through all of the settings in addition to the sliders. This will be the only video where that is the case though. The sliders will be updated throughout the course of the year as gameplay changes, as I get to test more, as EA drop patches. The settings will only feature in this video. So if you do want to stay up to date with this slider set, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure notifications are turned on. The second thing to know is that my slider sets are designed to create realistic gameplay, not necessarily more difficult gameplay, not necessarily even more entertaining and more fun gameplay, but gameplay that replicates what you see in real life every weekend on actual football pitches. For that reason, I will be using 10-minute halves, I will be using legendary difficulty, and I will be using full manual controls. However, I realized that that's not necessarily the way that everybody likes to play, so this video will feature 3 different slider sets. The standard set for people who want to play the game in the way that I've just described, a harder set for people who are more talented at the game than me. That's a fairly low bar to clear, to be fair. But people who find the standard set a little too easy, and then the assisted set for players who don't want to use the full manual controls. In addition to that, I will be releasing other versions of the slider set throughout the year as well. There will be a CPU versus CPU / player career / tactical view slider set. Those kind of all go in the same bundle where it's not so much on the user, but it's primarily CPU versus CPU. And then there will be a shorter halves version of the slider set in the future as well for players who don't want to play on 10-minute halves but prefer that 4, 5, 6 minute range. The next thing to note is that these are the sliders that I'll be using in all of my career mode series. There are currently 2 episodes of our Realistic Crystal Palace career mode on the channel already featuring ChatGPT, and there will be a Creator Club Road to Glory dropping on the channel soon as well. The final thing to note is that if you want early access to future updates of these sliders, as well as all other new videos on the channel, you can become a 12th man member of the channel today. So with all that being said, let's get into first the gameplay settings. Now, some of the bits and pieces in the gameplay settings will be personal preference. However, I'll tell you A, what I prefer, and B, what I think is more realistic. Those two things do tend to go hand in hand. Auto shots and assisted headers, for example, doesn't matter too much if these are on or off. I have them set to off just to increase the reliance on the user a little bit, force you to be a bit more reactive and a bit more precise with your inputs. The same can be said for timed finishing. I like to have this on, just have the option there. I don't use it a great deal during games, but if I'm lining one up from outside the box, I'll quite often try and time that just to increase the chances of it going in the top corner. Auto flare pass I have off. This just happens too often. You see silly little auto flare passes from time to time. It just breaks the immersion a little bit. All of the other settings in here, as I said, I'm going to have set to manual. Stay tuned for the assisted set of sliders towards the end of this video if you don't want to be using manual controls. I would, however, heavily recommend using manual controls. If you care about realism at all, if you care about creating a realistic experience on FC25, I think manual controls are an absolutely integral part of that. With all of these set to assisted, it's just too easy to ping the ball around. It's too easy to play that one-touch pass and move style football that the top teams in the world can play for periods, but it's not sustainable over the course of 90 minutes, and you certainly don't see teams in lower leagues playing that style of football. It also speeds up the pace of the game so much on assisted, since there is so few errors in the game. It is so easy to pass and move. When you have all of these set to manual, it really forces you to firstly be precise in your input, but then to slow the game down, to take a touch, to make sure you've got control of the ball before you then try and pass the ball on to the next player. With all of these set to manual, you can't just string 4 or 5 passes together, pick the CPU team apart, and then just fire one into the top corner from just inside the penalty area. You have to slow it down. You have to build up. You have to play through the lines. So shot assistance, I have set to manual. You have to really precisely aim where this shot is going. There's far more of a margin, far less of a margin for error on manual than there is on assisted. Through pass, lobbed pass, ground pass, cross, lob, all set to manual. Crossing in the past has been a little bit tricky on manual. I do sometimes have this set to semi. It's working fine at the moment on FC25 on manual, so I will be leaving it there. I spent the majority of FC24 on semi-assisted crossing though. So the final thing I'll say about the manual controls is that they take a lot of getting used to. It is difficult if you're used to playing assisted to switch to manual. I would recommend drop the difficulty down a level, make the switch to manual, get familiar with it, get the hang of it there, and then you can step back up to your prior difficulty level once you've got control of how the manual controls work. But the time you put in to getting the hang of it is so worth it. I transitioned to manual several years ago now. I can't imagine playing the game on assisted now. It's so much more realistic. It's so much more enjoyable. It's so much more rewarding playing the game on manual because you really have to work to score a goal. It's so rewarding when you put a perfect move together and the ball ends up in the back of the net. It's got more soul than assisted. Pass receiver lock, I currently have set to late. I think late is the appropriate setting if you are using manual controls because, as I said, it is slower. You do take more time picking the player you want to pass to, powering up your pass as well. So you want the pass receiver to be locked as late as possible, approximately when the ball is kicked. If you are playing on assisted controls, so you're using the assisted slider set, I would have this set to animation start. Pass precision, sensitivity, I would have set to high. I don't use precision passing, but I would have it set to high if you do want to use that. Auto clearances I have on. This is different from auto shots. Auto shots, I want to have to react to the ball in the box to put it in the back of the net. I don't want the ball bouncing inside the 6-yard box, me not having time to react, and I concede a goal though. So I have this set to on. Clearance assistance, I have set to directional, so I can control where the ball goes when I clear it. I do often clear with the X button as well, rather than the B button. Just, you know, a long pass, essentially. I'm clearing the ball, but it has more of a chance of ending up with one of my players. Jockey, I have set to manual. Defending, I definitely think advanced defending is the best. It gives you the shoulder challenge or the seal out option. Pass block assistance set to on. I've accidentally flicked through the tabs at the top. Auto switching on air balls and loose balls. Auto switching move assistance is none. Classic right stick switching, player relative. All of this is pretty much default. I don't think I've changed really anything down here except contextual dribbling. I want to make sure that is on, triggered in one-on-one situations. Goalkeeper save assistance doesn't really matter. And then finally, analog sprint I like to have on as well. So as I said, I like to play on 10-minute halves and on legendary difficulty. So that's my recommended half length and difficulty level. The 10-minute halves really pairs nicely with the manual controls. Again, you're slowing the game down on manual controls. You can have those periods of time where you just keep possession of the ball, you play across the back line, you kind of take a breather like you see teams do in real life, rather than 5-minute halves, everything assisted, every input perfect, and it's just back and forth like a basketball game. Competitor mode, I turn off. Player-based difficulty, I turn off. You simply don't need to use these. They kind of make players stand out in a kind of awkward immersion breaking way. I prefer just to have them off. I think FIFA and FC actually do a really good job for a sports game of delineating between the best and the worst rated players. If I'm using a player rated in the mid to high 90s versus a player in, you know, the mid to high 70s, you can already feel the difference between those players. You can already see the difference between those kinds of players on the CPU team. So leave those turned off. Attributes, though, set to default. So this is going to give a boost, and it is going to take away attribute points from players when they are out of position. And again, I think this reflects the real life experience. You play a player out of position, he's not going to play as well there. So leave that to default. That will be the case. Quick substitutes, you can choose. Full match intro is back, thank the Lord. So I've got that set to always. Again, personal preference for you. Now, the big one, the camera settings. I don't remember if I went over this in FC24, but this is by far the most common question I have had on any video on my channel. What are the camera settings? So I'm going to go over those here today to make sure they are in this one. So I always have EA Sports Game Cam for the single player camera, and I have some custom camera settings as well. So I have the height set to 5, zoom is 15, far side focus is 15, ball tracking speed is 0, penalty area zoom is 12, and then there is no power shot zoom. So these settings, I think, most reflect the kind of camera angles you see in real life, on real life football game broadcasts. That's what I've tried to replicate. The angle does change slightly from stadium to stadium, which is a good thing, but these give you the best balance and the most realistic angles at each stadium, I would say. I won't bother going over the visual and the audio settings, nor the accessibility and the graphics, obviously. We will touch on the rules, though. Injuries on, offsides on, bookings on. Handballs are currently off. They should not be. They should be on except for penalties. That way you'll get free kicks for handballs, but you'll never give away a penalty for a handball. Referee strictness at the moment for FC25 is set to strict. That's where I started on FC24. That did change and develop over the course of the year, though. Right now I have it set to strict. That seems to be a good place to be for FC25 at the moment. That might change over the course of the year, and I will be sure to update that in future slider updates if it does change. Now, one important thing to note about the gameplay sliders is that you do want to make sure that they are set in the main menu settings as well as in your career mode. So you want to go to settings, to game settings, and scroll across to simulation settings. Make sure the sliders are set here as well as in your actual career mode. It does seem this year as if certain games in your career mode get locked to the main menu sliders, and it doesn't really matter what changes you make in your career mode save, and in particular in the game, if you adjust the sliders during a game, and it doesn't change. It doesn't change anything. You can test this yourself by going into a game, setting the, let's say, sprint speed and acceleration sliders to 0, set them to 99. A couple minutes later, you'll see no difference. And that's because the sliders are locked to the main menu sliders. So best practice is just to set them in the main menu, set them in your career mode, make sure they match up. You've had to do this in the past with other EA Sports games, Madden in particular. Never really had to do it with FIFA, but this year that does seem to be a problem. For the couple of settings at the top here, I have wind effects set to low and weather effects set to off. Anything above low just has far too much of an impact on the ball. High, it feels like you're playing with a beach ball rather than a football. It's just absolutely ludicrous. Medium potentially could be an option. I feel like this might be something that's addressed in a patch fairly early on during the cycle. And I think if it is, medium hopefully is going to be a viable option. But for now, low is the only one that's even semi-realistic. And the same with the weather effects. They have far too much of an impact on the game with them on. It's like running through quicksand rather than sodden grass. Your players take far too long to accelerate, to change direction. It's almost impossible to dribble. Your passes go 3 feet in front of you. Again, I hope this is kind of patched and smoothed out and refined slightly, but for now you just pretty much have to have the weather effects off, unfortunately. As for the sliders themselves, we have got a number of values that are going to look very, very different from values we might have been using in the past, and one immediately jumps out. We've got sprint speed at 44 for both the user and the CPU. We've got acceleration at 48 for the user and at 46 for the CPU. Now, one of the main reasons for this is that EA have completely removed the game speed option. There used to be an option in the gameplay settings where you could set it to slow or default or fast game speed. No longer an option, doesn't exist in the game anymore. Fortunately, however, it does seem this year as if we can lower acceleration for each team without it having game-breaking effects. Previously, if you lowered this below 50, it would have certain game-breaking effects, like affecting the integrity of the defensive lines, causing defenders in particular to kind of shuffle and jockey rather than to sprint back, not track runners, and that kind of thing. At this stage in the cycle, at the very least, I've lowered acceleration for both the user and the CPU, and it hasn't had those kind of negative effects. Sprint speed, we usually have extremely low, down at like 5 for both the user and the CPU. 5 to 10 tends to be the normal range when we had the game speed option, basically. But 44 is plenty for this year, and if you get much below that, it starts to feel like players are running through quicksand again. We do also have a discrepancy between the user and the CPU in terms of acceleration. So the user has +2 acceleration. One of the biggest problems in FC25 so far has been just the lack of alertness. Your players are not on their toes to anywhere near the same extent that the CPU players are. And if you're not controlling a player, they're just kind of absent, they're vacant, they're not involved, they're not engaged in any kind of activity really on the pitch, and that makes it far too easy for CPU players of any kind really, but particularly pacey attackers, to get in behind, and you just don't have the time to react, to switch on to that player, and then to catch up with the CPU attacker who's already got that head start on you because they are alert, because they are on their toes, because they are switched on. So with that discrepancy between the acceleration for the user and the CPU, you get that extra little bit of time, you get that burst to allow yourself to allow your players rather to maintain a defensive position and to stay in those one-on-one battles and to stay goal side of the CPU attackers. In terms of shot error, we have 50 for the user and 55 for the CPU. Like in FC24, we don't want to raise this slider too high. If you are experiencing the CPU team scoring too many goals, the main instinct that people have, the main reaction they tend to think is the appropriate one, is to whack the shot error way up. CPU scoring too many goals, let me increase the shot error, then they're going to be getting fewer shots on target, so they'll be scoring fewer goals. Unfortunately, it doesn't tend to have that effect, and the effect that it does have is that it just narrows the number or the types of shots that the CPU are willing to take, and then you end up with just one type of goal being scored. That was the case on FC24. If you raise the shot error slider too high, every single goal the CPU scored would be in the top corner. Every goal would look the same. That's the case again here. So we don't want to be raising shot error too high. Instead, what we want to do is adjust shot speed. That has a far better impact, a far more realistic impact on reducing the number of goals per game. Pass error we have at 5 for the user and at 50 for the CPU. If you are going to be using assisted controls, obviously you will not have pass error all the way down at 5. Stay tuned for the assisted set later in the video. But if you're using manual controls, you absolutely want a very, very low pass error value. The reason for that is because you're going to be making plenty of errors in terms of your own inputs. Your left stick directional inputs and your, pass power inputs with the A, with the X, with the Y button, or X and square and triangle if you're on PlayStation. You don't need the computer to implement or to, you know, impose an error upon you, because you're going to be making those user input errors yourself. We want the ball to go where we point the left stick, and we want it to be, you know, passed with the power that we've input. We will make the mistakes ourselves. Shot speed, as I mentioned earlier, is the main way we're going to address goals per game for both sides, but mostly for the CPU. So this is going to be dropped to 48 for the user and all the way down to 34 for the CPU. So the reason that this reduces goals per game is because it gives your goalkeeper more time to react. With a lower shot speed, your goalkeeper obviously has more time to adjust to the ball as it's traveling towards him through the air. There are going to be fewer goals scored as a result. Your goalkeeper will be saving more shots as a result. So unlike with raising the shot error, with a lower shot speed, we still keep the variety of shots. Fewer of them go in. You can still have a lot of shots on target, but fewer of them are scored. Pass speed, we want to lower for both the user and the CPU. 44 for the user, 36 for the CPU. This, along with the reduced shot speed and particularly reduced sprint speed and acceleration, is part of slowing the whole game down. We obviously know that on all default values, the game is just far too quick, much too fast-paced to be really realistic in any way. So this is part of what contributes to a slower overall game. And again, these pair with the manual controls. With much slower pass speed, with manual controls, you're slowing the game right down. You're having to take touches. The opposition obviously have more time to intercept as well with the lower pass speed. So you have to pick your passes more carefully. With default values on assisted controls, you can play extremely risky passes with impunity, basically, because the chance of the CPU intercepting it is so low. Not the case with manual controls, not the case with the lower pass speed. You have to be really careful and far more measured in your possession and approach play. Injury frequency and severity. If you're new to the channel, new to these kind of slider sets, these are probably going to look pretty strange. We've got injury frequency all the way up at 85 for both teams. Severity all the way down at 15. If you've used my FC24 slider sets, these are pretty much in line with what we do in the vast majority of editions. But you want very, very high frequency so that players get injured often during the game, but very low severity, so most of those injuries can be run off and they don't linger beyond the game, and players aren't kept out, you know, for future fixtures. That's what you see in real life. Players go down injured anywhere from, you know, 5 to 10, even more than that times per game. The vast majority of the time, they get up, they carry on, they run it off. It's a dead leg, it's a stinger on the ankle, studs down the Achilles, something like that, they can play on. That's what you get with these kinds of slider values. Despite the severity being so low, you will absolutely still see injuries that linger though. You'll have players out for 3 months with the broken toe like we saw all of the time on FC24. That doesn't seem to be so much of an issue on 25 though. It's still early days, but there does seem to be more of a variety of injuries on FC25. In particular, with these values, they will be refined, I'm sure, but I'm seeing a decent range of injuries with these particular values. It was impossible, not just almost impossible, it was impossible to find values on FC24 where you could get injuries but avoid a broken toe injury every other game. These seem to be in a good spot for now. Goalkeeper ability, you want it 75 for the user and 35 for the CPU. Again, this is pretty much in line with what we tend to do in most editions, what we were doing on FC24. The user goalkeeper just needs a boost. They're not good enough. The CPU goalkeeper, too good, so we take some points off. These do need to be paired with the shot speed slider as well, though. So, again, you can't lower the shot speed and massively raise the goalkeeper ability. They have to kind of work in tandem, because obviously the more you lower the shot speed, the easier it's going to be for your goalkeeper to make those saves. So you can't just whack the goalkeeper ability slider way up and just kind of completely ignore what you've got for shot speed. You have to consider the two and kind of tweak and refine the two in conjunction with one another. Marking is going to be set at 60 for both teams. This does tend to be a slider value that fluctuates over the course of the year with patches and things like that. It does depend a lot on the shape of the game as well, in terms of line height, length, and width, which we'll get to in just a bit. But based on the way that we've got the game set up in terms of the shape, 60 marking is a good balance for the time being at the very least. I did mess around with kind of the 50 to 55 range. I did bump it all the way up to 70 to 75 as well. 60 feels like the sweet spot to me for now. And then we've got another value that does stand out as being very different from what we usually do. Run frequency are usually lower for both teams. I think on the majority of FC24, I had 25 run frequency for the user and 20 for the CPU. It's all the way up at 75 for the user on this particular edition, 35 for the CPU. This is another big problem with FC25 as it currently stands. The player roles have far too much of an impact on the way that the players behave on the pitch. Obviously, you want the players to adhere to their player roles. You want them to be behaving in the way that that player role would suggest that they should behave. However, they can't only behave in that way. There does need to be some kind of logic beyond the player role. However, at the moment, there's just not. If you have, for example, an inside forward set to attack, they will do that and that only. There is no tracking back whatsoever. If you have a box-to-box midfielder set to balanced, or God forbid a holding midfielder, a deep-lying playmaker, that kind of thing, they will never get forward to support the play. You want the player roles to be the way that players usually behave. They have to be able to break out of that and kind of use a bit of common sense logic to involve themselves in the game in other ways. It's just not happening at the moment. With run frequency at 75, though, it does encourage more of that kind of behavior. Players will break forward a little more because we're kind of using the slider to almost override, not override, but to supplement, to encourage what the player roles aren't currently offering or allowing. As for the shape of the game, this is what I was talking about in terms of pairing with those marking sliders. It's really the line height, length, width, the marking, the run frequency that gives the game that overall shape, the overall dynamics of matches. So we've got line height for the user and the CPU both set at 35. We've got length again for both at 40 and the width for both at 45. The defensive line is just too high at default. I do tend to actually raise the line height in most slider editions. That's what I did frequently on FC24. I like this up around 70 if we can get it there. However, this year's is very, very different. Defensive lines are too high. And again, as I said earlier, it's too easy for pacey attackers to get in behind. So we need that line height to be dropped. Gives a more realistic shape to the game. Line length, we need to reduce slightly as well. So if we're dropping that defensive line back, we can't allow the midfield and the front line to be too far up the field away from that defensive line. So we need to drag them back a little as well to keep that overall shape, move the entire team rather than just the back line. And then width, I do like to narrow this slightly. Teams do tend to play narrow in real life. They tend to allow attacks down the flanks. They tend to kind of condense around the penalty area. 50 is just a little too high. And does allow the team to spread slightly too wide. I've narrowed this to 45. Well, this is a really good balance with the height, length, width, with the run frequency, with the marking. Gives a really good base at the very least to work from and to refine later on. You'll notice a lot of these values do end in a 5 or a 0. That's how it tends to be early in the cycle. You're moving 5 at a time, 10 at a time, that kind of thing, just to get the overall shape, the overall foundation, and then we can refine with kind of increments of 1 or 2 or 3 once we've got the basic shape of the game down. I usually lower the fullback positioning slightly for the user. It tends to be fine for the CPU at 50, but at 50 for the user, fullbacks drift a little too high up the pitch, and it can be difficult to play across the back line from time to time. I almost always have this set at 25, and it seems to me that you want it set there again this year. Power bar is completely personal preference. So this just dictates how quickly the power bar will fill up when you're making some kind of an input for a pass or a cross or a shot. It's entirely up to you where you feel comfortable. I like it at 62. And then finally, we've got the first touch control error. 5 for the user, 99 for the CPU. Again, if you are new to my slider sets at the very least, this is probably going to look fairly strange. If you've used my FC24 slider sets before, you'll know this is kind of, where I like to have it. This is one of those sliders. I mean, most of the sliders are this way, to be fair, but this one in particular, it doesn't only do what you would think it does based on the name. So you would think this slider controls how much error is imparted on my player's first touches. And whilst it does do that, that's really only a snippet of what it does. This slider very much controls who loose balls end up with. You'll find with these both set to 50, the ball bounces the CPU's way almost always. When we have a discrepancy, when we lower the slider for the user and increase it for the CPU, you'll notice there's a lot more 50-50 distribution of those loose balls, those deflections. You'll notice kind of shoulder to shoulder tackles your players are a little bit stronger in, and you'll also notice that your players just win tackles more cleanly more often. I'm sure if you've been playing FC 24, 25, you will have been frustrated at some point that you perfectly time a tackle and it just bounces off your player and the CPU attacker just continues. It's like you never even made a tackle. Even if the tackle is successful, the ball bounces off them and it somehow miraculously finds its way to another CPU player instead. That's far less the case when you have this discrepancy. As for the CPU sliders, these are obviously a new addition to FC25, and I think they are a welcome addition. We've been asking for things like this for some time, being able to manually adjust how often teams shoot, for example, how often teams cross. We would have loved that in FC24. However, now that it is here, I am a little concerned about certain things regarding these sliders. So firstly, we have a couple of options. We can set our own sliders. We can use tactical. We can use dynamic. The difference between tactical and dynamic, I don't think is all that clear. However, I'm not too concerned with the exact difference between the two at this stage. With each of these options, basically what happens is, although they're all set to 50 right now, when you begin a match, these slider values will either be raised or lowered. It's not clear though what logic goes into those slider values. I don't know whether it's completely random, whether there's some kind of algorithm behind it, whether it's tied in some way to the team's tactics. It's not really clear how those slider values are determined. So that's one thing that does slightly concern me. The other thing that slightly concerns me, and concerns me more, to be honest, is that when you begin a match, some of these slider values can be extreme. Build up speed, for example, you might start a match and it's just randomly set to 1. That's not going to be ideal because the CPU team is just going to be playing the ball around at the back. They're never going to be making forward runs. They are not going to threaten your penalty area at all. You're going to have an extremely easy game. The same thing with things like dribble frequency, skill move frequency. These might just randomly be whacked way up in the 90s. And then again, CPU players are just going to be trying to dribble past you non-stop, ignoring completely open teammates. You're not going to get a realistic experience if you end up with those kinds of slider values. And again, we don't really know how the CPU determines what the values are going to be. So the other option is to use a set of custom sliders. That way, you know what these slider values are going to be when you begin each game. However, my concern on the other hand with that is that then going to make the CPU teams too similar? It's not going to differentiate from team to team in terms of the way that they play. That's the advantage with the tactical and the dynamic. There is going to be variation in the way that teams approach the games using those sliders because the slider values are going to be different. On custom, that's obviously not going to be the case. We do obviously have tactics formations, of course, are going to make a difference. And there is, of course, the player roles. So it could be the case that these sliders provide a good baseline in terms of the way that teams will set up against you and the way that they will go about playing the game. And then those player roles, those tactics can create the variation between teams. That's kind of the way it worked on FC24, I guess, because I guess these kinds of things existed kind of underneath the hood in FC24. It's just we've got access to them now. And teams certainly played differently on FC24. Maybe not extremely differently, but I think noticeably. So I think the way that I will approach it for the time being is to use custom sliders. And this is the set that I've arrived at for the time being. Again, like the gameplay sliders, it is a work in progress. It is going to take a lot of testing to really refine and to finalize a slider set here. It may also be the case in the future that it is just better to use tactical or dynamic. It's going to take a lot more testing. We need a much bigger sample size to make any kind of final decisions. But for now, these have been working very well for me. There's been a nice balance between teams kind of building up at the back with a slower build-up speed, like 25, but also breaking forward at the appropriate times. And also at appropriate moments in the game as well. I was playing a game recently, for example, where I was dominating possession. The CPU team was sitting back. They were building up very slowly. There was a lot of kind of possession play deep in their own half. I took the lead in the game, though. I went 1-0 up, and suddenly they had more impetus. Suddenly they were trying to get back in the game. I assume they'd made a tactical switch, moved to a more aggressive tactical setup. And so they changed the way that they were playing to try and equalize, to try and get back into the game, even with the build-up speed set to 25. So right now I've got tackle aggression at 99, build-up speed 25, shot frequency is at 75, first touch pass frequency rather is at 50. You want crossing on 75. One thing I have noticed with the crossing is the higher you raise this slider, the deeper the crosses tend to go. I experimented with this at 99 as well. All of the crosses were not only towards the back post, but almost towards the back corner of the penalty area. And the more that I lowered this, the more towards the middle of the box the crosses ended up kind of targeting. So as with a lot of the gameplay sliders, there tends to be unintended consequences, or at the very least, consequences that you wouldn't anticipate when you adjust a lot of these sliders. Dribble frequency and skill move frequency currently set to 35. So it's kind of up to you what you do here. As I said, this has been a set that has worked well for me, especially when paired with those gameplay sliders. So this is what I would recommend for now. If you want to experiment with tactical, with dynamic, I think that would be a perfectly fine option this early in the cycle as well. Now, as for the career mode settings themselves, so these will be the settings that you change, that you adjust when you start a new career mode save, just after you have either chosen or created your manager. There's a couple of things in here that you might want to change. Again, a lot of this is personal preference, but these are the settings that I use to, in my opinion, create the most realistic experience. So firstly, if you are starting a new career mode save early in the cycle, before the January transfer window, basically disable the first window if you want a realistic experience. If you want to be able to sign players at the very beginning of the year, obviously you can leave this on. This could change later in the year because we should be getting for the first time live starts in FC25, and I'm not quite sure how that will interact with this particular setting. If we start a career mode, for example, in November using the live start, so we've got everything kind of up to date as it is in real life, statistics, league standings, squads, all that kind of stuff. We've got up to date for November, and that's when we're starting our career mode save. Obviously, our next window would be January. So the first window that will be coming across in the career mode save is going to be January. So we would obviously want to then start with this enabled so that we can have that active, ready for the January transfer window. However, I'm not sure if first window is going to mean the first window you come across in your career mode save or the first window of the year. This may still refer to the summer. and then the January transfer window one will just be open anyway. So who knows? But for now, disable the first window. Scouting, I do like to have on. Training plans on as well. Difficulty level, like we said, legendary. Financial takeover, if you're doing some kind of a realistic takeover rebuild, like mine with Everton on the channel, check that out if you haven't already. Obviously, you can implement that. Most often, though, you're obviously going to want it disabled. And then board expectations. No sacking is the option that you want. And yes, it is realistic. I've had a couple of comments on my Crystal Palace career mode as well. Oh, if he's trying to do it realistic, why is he turning sacking off? So that I don't get sacked in an unrealistic manner, obviously. So that I don't get sacked for no reason, which would be unrealistic. So this way, I can keep my job. Obviously, if you determine that you should be sacked, you can always resign from the club. You can always move to a different one. You can always start a new save. You can also, as we're doing in the Crystal Palace career mode, set yourself custom objectives and set actual realistic consequences for achieving or failing those objectives. For example, in the Crystal Palace save that I currently have going, we're trying to finish in the top 10 of the Premier League. If we do, we can keep hold of both Eze and Mark Gahey. If we finish around mid-table, so in the kind of 10 to 12 range, we can keep one of them. We have to sell the other. If we finish below that, so 13th or below, we have to sell both Eze and Gahey. So I'm not getting fired. I'm getting a realistic consequence, forcing myself to have to sell either one or both of those players, depending on where we finish in the league, depending on, you know, how it's perceived, how well it's perceived that we've done that season, and how motivated those players will be to remain at the club. Half length, set at 10 minutes. Again, difficulty level legendary. I'm setting 5 minutes for the youth tournament match length. That seems plenty. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time playing those tournaments, to be honest. And then the youth player quality I have at current overall. Simulation gameplay we've been over already. Training I have set to on. Training plan recovery rates I have set to realistic. This does make it really, really difficult to have both the energy, the stamina, and the sharpness both at green, both at 100% all of the time. It was far too easy to have it that way in FC24. If you set this to realistic, it is tough to get them both in sync and have them both at full. You can have fitness full, but sharpness is going to take a bit of a hit. You can have sharpness full, but the fitness is going to take a bit of a hit. And I think that replicates the congested fixture lists that Premier League teams tend to have, especially if you've got a European competition as well. Forces you to use more of your squad, forces you to keep on top of those training plans as well. I have the training plan availability set to manual and automated. I do turn training drills off here. That seems to have no effect whatsoever because the training drills keep popping up anyway during the career mode save. So slightly frustrating. Set this to off. Hopefully they'll patch it at some point and it will actually be turned off. Development rate, I have older players on slow and younger players on fast. I want young players to get better quicker. I want older players to not get much better at all. Disable first window we've covered already. Transfer approaches I like to have set to strict. You can set this to loose just to broaden the number of options that you have in terms of players available that you're able to buy, and you can choose who you think is most realistic. I like it set to strict, just so that it's a bit more difficult to get the players that I want, or to even prevent me from getting the players that I want. It's still a bit too easy in FC25, even when you're imposing restrictions on yourself, to just identify a player that you want and to just go and get them. Doesn't always work out that way in real life. Scouting on, search players on. One thing about scouting actually is that if you have the transfer set to disable first window, the scouting doesn't appear for the first month or two of the save. I think it appears in October or November or something like that. But there's just literally no transfer tab in August, in September, maybe even into October. I don't remember exactly, but that will appear before the January transfer window. search players on. Scouting speed star players are like set to instant, but general players I have set to slow. And then there's very little in the general settings. No sacking. International job offers I turn off. You don't really see managers at a club and a country at the same time. European competitions on, and then currency, whatever you would prefer, obviously. So I will put the full set of sliders in the description below, but here it is in its entirety if you want to pause the video and input these into the game. As I said, though, this video will feature 3 different slider sets, so that's the standard version. If you want to play 10-minute halves, legendary difficulty, full manual controls, you can plug in these sliders right away. You will be good to go. If you're better than I am at the game, though, you might find them a little bit too easy. If that's the case, check out the harder set. So again, feel free to pause the video if you do want to input these into your game. These will be in the description as well. But the harder version is going to essentially keep the shape of the game the same. So we've got the line height, the line length, the line width, all the same. Things like fullback positioning is the same too. But there's going to be some changes to certain values that's going to make the game more difficult. So for example, we have eliminated the discrepancy in acceleration between the user and the CPU. Now it's 48 and 48 each. We have increased the pass speed for the CPU. We have increased the shot speed for the CPU. We have reversed the shot error values. 55 for the user this time, 50 for the CPU. We've increased marking to 75. We've increased run frequency for the CPU. We've also leveled out the first touch control error. It's now 50-50 in terms of user CPU. So those values will make the game a bit more difficult. They are still recommended for use with manual controls though. If you don't want to use manual controls, again, I highly recommend it if you are looking for a realistic experience on FC25, even if it takes a bit of time to get used to. If you do want to use assisted controls though, this next set is for you. So the assisted version is going to be very similar to the standard version, but it's going to be mainly the error values where we can see the differences, particularly on pass error. So pass error is set all the way up at 90 for the user. So obviously you're not going to be making anywhere near as many mistakes yourself with your own inputs, because those inputs are going to be assisted by the CPU to help the ball get to where it needs to be. So you need the game to implement those errors for you. Because those inputs are so accurate, we have lowered things like shot speed just a little bit as well. And that first touch control error, although it's back at 99 for the CPU, is set to 50 for the user. So there you have it, version 1 of my slider set. As I said, it is very much a work in progress at this stage. It's early days in the FC25 cycle. I did get to play the beta, so I did have some time to test there as well. But sample size is always the most important thing when we're adjusting sliders, and we just haven't had time yet to get a big enough sample size to really settle on the final version, obviously. Plus, there's also going to be patches that come later down the line that are going to change things. So these sliders will be very fluid. They will chop and change over the course of the year. So again, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you got notifications on. If you want to see these sliders in action, check out the first episode or 2 of our realistic Crystal Palace career mode featuring ChatGPT. And again, if you want early access to all of those slider updates, as well as new episodes of all the career mode series and everything else in between, check out the join button on the homepage. Look into becoming a 12th man member of the channel. But that will do it for this one. I hope to see you in the next one. Take it easy.